Sometimes the things people throw away are worth the most. Nobody paid attention when Ethan Walker said those words. In fact, most of them laughed. The laughter echoed through the auction room of Hayes Automotive Holdings, bouncing off polished walls and glass windows that overlooked downtown Columbus, Ohio. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive cologne. Men in tailored suits shuffled paperwork. Investors checked their phones. Nobody had come for the abandoned garage sitting at the bottom of the asset list. Nobody except Ethan. Charlotte Hayes sat at the front of the room, confident and composed, her charcoal gray blazer as sharp as the reputation that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the Midwest. She glanced down at the final document and shook her head almost imperceptibly. The old garage had been a burden for years. Leaky roof, rusted equipment, broken windows. A property everyone in the company referred to as a junkyard with walls. $1,000, the auction manager announced. Any other offers? Silence. A few people exchanged amused smiles. Someone in the back muttered, "The land alone isn't worth the cleanup costs." Another chuckled, "Whoever buys that place deserves it." Ethan remained still. His hands rested calmly on the table. His worn denim jacket looked out of place among luxury watches and polished shoes. Yet there was something steady about him, something that didn't bend under mockery. "Sold," the auction manager declared. To Mr. Ethan Walker. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Charlotte leaned toward her assistant. "At least it's off our books," she said quietly. "One less headache." Ethan heard the comment. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. And still he smiled. Not because he was offended, not because he wanted revenge, but because he had learned something years ago. The world often mistakes value for appearance. As the crowd filed out, Charlotte happened to pass him near the exit. She offered a professional nod. "Good luck with the garage, Mr. Walker." Ethan met her eyes. "Thank you. You'll probably need it." A few nearby executives laughed again. Charlotte didn't mean to be cruel. She simply believed she was being realistic. Ethan nodded once. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it just needs someone willing to see what everyone else missed." For the first time, Charlotte paused. Only for a second. Then she smiled politely and continued walking. Outside, cold autumn wind swept through the parking garage. Ethan stood beside his aging Ford F-150 and pulled the property folder from under his arm. The papers fluttered slightly in the breeze. Across the city skyline, the afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows over brick buildings and forgotten streets. Most people saw a worthless garage. Most people saw failure waiting to happen. But Ethan saw something else. He saw possibility. He saw a second chance. And although nobody in that room could have known it yet, 6 months later the same people who laughed that afternoon would stand speechless, staring at something far greater than a garage. They would be staring at the beginning of an empire. That evening, the temperature dropped into the low 40s as Ethan drove across the edge of town with the property folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. The city lights faded behind him one by one until only the narrow county road remained. His old pickup rattled slightly over every crack in the pavement, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were somewhere else. They were fixed on a building that almost everyone believed was worthless. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the gravel driveway of a small white house tucked beneath a row of aging maple trees. The porch light was already on. Warm yellow light spilled through the living room window. Before he even stepped out of the truck, the front door opened. Sophie Walker came running down the porch steps. Her blonde ponytail bounced behind her as she crossed the yard. "Dad," she called. "Did you get it?" Ethan smiled despite the exhaustion sitting on his shoulders. "I did." Sophie's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" She threw her arms around him. For a moment, the weight of the day disappeared. The laughter from the auction room no longer mattered. The doubtful looks no longer mattered. What mattered was the little girl standing in front of him. The two of them walked inside together. The house was modest. The furniture did not match. The kitchen cabinets showed years of wear. But it was home. Sophie climbed onto a stool while Ethan opened the refrigerator and pulled out leftover chicken soup. "So what happens now?" she asked. Ethan poured the soup into a pot and set it on the stove. "Now we work. A lot. Probably more than ever." Sophie nodded seriously. "Good. I can help." Ethan laughed softly. "You already do." Outside, the wind rattled the tree branches against the roof. Inside, the smell of soup slowly filled the room. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then Sophie glanced toward the stack of unpaid bills sitting near the counter. Her smile faded. Dad, yeah. She hesitated. Are we going to lose this house too? The question settled heavily between them. Ethan stopped stirring the soup. He looked at the bills, the mortgage notices, the overdue utility statements, the reminders he had stopped opening because he already knew what they said. Losing his engineering job 18 months earlier had changed everything. Since then he had taken whatever work he could find. Repairs, consulting, odd mechanical jobs. Enough to survive, never enough to move forward. Sophie stared down at her hands. You do not have to answer if you do not want to. Ethan set the spoon aside and crouched beside her chair. Look at me. She did. We are not giving up. But what if it does not work? Ethan glanced through the kitchen window toward the distant edge of town where the old garage sat waiting in darkness. Broken windows, rusted doors, forgotten by almost everyone. Then he looked back at his daughter. That place is not just a building, he said quietly. It is our second chance. Sophie studied his face for several seconds. Then she smiled. Small at first, then bigger, because she trusted him. And sometimes trust is stronger than certainty. Later that night, long after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was silent except for the ticking wall clock. Moonlight spilled across the property folder. He opened it slowly and looked at the faded photographs attached to the final page. Most people saw a garage waiting to be demolished. Ethan saw something different. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he felt certain that somewhere inside those crumbling walls was the answer that could change everything. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and cold November air. Frost clung to the weeds surrounding the abandoned property as Ethan pulled his pickup onto the cracked asphalt lot. The garage stood exactly as he remembered it from the auction photos, tired and forgotten. Rust streaked down the metal siding. Several windows were boarded shut. One corner of the roof sagged slightly under years of neglect. Anyone driving past would have seen a building at the end of its life. Ethan saw a building waiting for a second chance. He stepped out of the truck carrying a flashlight, a toolbox, and a notebook. Sophie followed close behind wearing an oversized knit hat that kept sliding over her eyes. It looks worse in person, she admitted. Ethan smiled. Most good stories start that way. Together they pushed open the main garage door. The hinges groaned loudly as sunlight spilled across decades of dust. The smell of old motor oil, dry wood, and forgotten machinery hung in the air. Rows of abandoned shelves lined the walls. Rusted tools sat untouched beneath thick layers of dirt. In one corner, an ancient hydraulic lift stood frozen in place like a monument from another era. Sophie looked around slowly. Do you really think this can work? Ethan ran his hand across an old workbench. I do. How? I do not know yet. She laughed. That is not very reassuring. Sometimes you have to start before you have all the answers. They spent hours cleaning. Dust floated through beams of light pouring from broken windows. Every box they opened seemed to contain another piece of the building's forgotten history. Old receipts, repair manuals, yellowed photographs, names of mechanics nobody remembered anymore. By early afternoon, Sophie discovered a small metal plaque partially hidden behind a shelf. Dad, look at this. Ethan walked over and brushed away the grime. The engraved letters were faded but still readable. Harrison Motor Works. Established 1972. Ethan frowned. The name felt strangely familiar. Not famous, not recent, but familiar. He pulled out his phone and searched. Several articles appeared immediately. Harrison Motor Works had once been a respected performance engineering company during the 1970s. Their founder, Leonard Harrison, had earned a reputation for innovative designs before mysteriously disappearing from the automotive industry decades earlier. Who was he? Sophie asked. Ethan continued reading. A very talented engineer. What happened to him? Ethan scrolled through article after article. None seemed to know. The company simply vanished. No bankruptcy. No scandal. Just gone. A strange feeling settled over him. He looked around the building again. Suddenly the garage felt different. Less like an abandoned property. More like a forgotten chapter waiting to be reopened. Hours later, while moving a heavy storage cabinet away from the back wall, Ethan noticed something unusual. The cabinet had not been bolted to the floor. It had been positioned there intentionally. Hidden. He and Sophie pushed together until the cabinet finally rolled aside. Behind it sat a narrow steel door almost completely concealed by dust and age. Sophie stared at it. Was that here yesterday? Ethan laughed softly. I am pretty sure it was. He pulled on the handle. At first it refused to move. Then with a sharp metallic click, it opened a few inches. Cold air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Father and daughter exchanged a look. Neither spoke for several seconds. Because deep inside, both of them sensed the same thing. They had just found something nobody else knew existed. The hidden room was smaller than Ethan expected. A narrow staircase disappeared beneath the garage floor, leading into darkness untouched by time. He switched on his flashlight and aimed the beam downward. Dust drifted through the air like floating snowflakes. The concrete steps looked old but solid. Sophie stood beside him, gripping the railing. Are we actually doing this? She asked. Ethan smiled. We did not come this far to stop now. Slowly they descended. The temperature dropped with every step. The sounds of the outside world faded until only their footsteps remained. At the bottom, they found a workshop unlike anything either of them had imagined. Metal shelves lined the walls. Old drafting tables stood covered with protective cloths. Filing cabinets filled an entire corner of the room. Everything was coated in decades of dust, yet strangely organized, as though someone had expected to return one day. Sophie slowly turned in a circle. This is incredible. Ethan barely heard her. His attention was fixed on a large wooden desk in the center of the room. He brushed away years of dust and revealed an engraved brass nameplate. Leonard Harrison, the same name from the articles. The same engineer who had vanished from the automotive world. Ethan opened the first desk drawer. Inside were notebooks filled with sketches, calculations, and handwritten observations. The pages were yellowed but carefully preserved. He flipped through them slowly. Every page revealed ideas far ahead of their time. Experimental suspension concepts, lightweight frame designs, fuel efficiency innovations. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This is not normal garage stuff, he whispered. Sophie leaned closer. How good was this guy? Ethan looked up. Good enough that people still write about him 50 years later. For the next several days they returned whenever they could. Ethan worked on cleanup projects during daylight hours and spent evenings studying Harrison's notes. The more he read, the more fascinated he became. Yet outside the garage, life continued applying pressure from every direction. Utility bills arrived. Mortgage notices arrived. The small savings account continued shrinking. Winter settled across Ohio with icy determination. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived from the bank. Ethan opened it at the kitchen table. Sophie watched quietly. Bad news? She asked. Ethan forced a smile. Just business. But after she left the room, his expression changed. The notice was clear. Unless he improved his financial situation within a few months, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. The house was no longer a distant concern. It had become a countdown. That night, Ethan sat alone in the garage long after sunset. Snowflakes drifted past broken windows. Wind whistled through gaps in the old structure. He stared at Harrison's notebooks spread across the workbench. For the first time since buying the property, doubt crept into his thoughts. Maybe everyone at the auction had been right. Maybe Charlotte Hayes had been right. Maybe this really was a mistake. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared from a former coworker. Heard you bought that dump. Hope you did not pay much. Ethan laughed quietly despite himself. Then he looked around the garage. At the rusted equipment. At the leaking roof. At the cracked concrete floor. The place looked hopeless. Yet his eyes eventually returned to Harrison's desk. There, tucked beneath one of the notebooks, he noticed a folded sheet of paper he had never seen before. Curious, he unfolded it carefully. His breath caught. It was not another journal page. It was a blueprint. A detailed engineering design unlike anything he had encountered before. Signed by Leonard Harrison himself. And at the bottom, written in fading blue ink, were 5 words that made Ethan sit perfectly still. Prototype. Never submitted for production. For several minutes Ethan simply stared at the blueprint. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the old garage creaked under the weight of another Ohio winter night. The faded paper trembled slightly in his hands. Not because of the cold. Because of what he was seeing. Every line was precise. Every measurement intentional. This was not the unfinished sketch of a dreamer. This was the work of a master engineer. He carried the blueprint home and spread it across the kitchen table after Sophie had finished her homework. She leaned over the paper and squinted. What is it? Ethan traced one section carefully with his finger. I think it is a suspension system. That sounds exciting. Ethan laughed. Trust me. For engineers, it is. Over the next several days, he studied every page hidden inside the folder. There were not just blueprints. There were performance notes, test results, design revisions, manufacturing estimates. Leonard Harrison had spent years developing a revolutionary system that balanced comfort, efficiency, and durability in ways the industry had not fully explored even decades later. Ethan could hardly believe it. Why would somebody hide this? Sophie asked one evening. Ethan shook his head. I do not know. Maybe he was waiting for the right person to find it. Ethan smiled. Maybe. Yet while excitement grew, reality remained stubborn. Bills continued arriving. Temperatures continued falling. One morning the furnace stopped working. Another unexpected expense. Another setback. Ethan spent half the day repairing it himself to save money. Every dollar mattered now. Every decision mattered. By January, the garage had become both his hope and his burden. During the day, he restored equipment and repaired the building. At night, he studied Harrison's designs. Sleep became a luxury. Coffee became a necessity. Some mornings he questioned whether any of it would lead anywhere at all. Then came a small breakthrough. While researching patent records, Ethan discovered something remarkable. Harrison had never filed final patents for most of his work. The designs had effectively disappeared from history. Forgotten. Unused. Waiting. Ethan sat back in his chair and stared at the computer screen. His heart raced. If the designs could be modernized and validated, they might still have value. Real value. The kind that could save more than a garage. The kind that could change a future. That afternoon, he returned to the property with renewed determination. Snow covered the lot in a thin white blanket. Inside the garage, sunlight streamed through cleaned windows for the first time in years. The place still looked rough, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. Sophie arrived after school carrying a paper bag. I brought sandwiches. You are officially my favorite business partner. She grinned. Good. Because I have an idea. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Probably not. She pulled out her phone. People love old buildings. People love mysteries. People love stories. Ethan immediately saw where she was going. You want to post something online? Why not? She asked. Nobody knows this place exists. Ethan hesitated. Part of him preferred staying invisible. Life had taught him that attention was not always kind. But another part of him knew they needed momentum. They needed opportunity. Most of all, they needed people to see what he was beginning to see. Sophie walked to the center of the garage and slowly turned in a circle while recording video. Dusty workbenches, vintage equipment, hidden workshop, Harrison's story. The building itself seemed to tell a story. One of loss, one of second chances, one of forgotten value. As Ethan watched his daughter filming, he felt something shift deep inside him. For months he had been trying to save a building. Now he realized something bigger might be happening. He was uncovering a legacy. And somewhere beyond those garage walls, the first sparks of an opportunity neither of them could yet imagine were already beginning to form. The video went online on a quiet Thursday evening. Neither Ethan nor Sophie expected much. They sat at the kitchen table watching the upload finish while rain tapped softly against the windows. The clip was simple. No dramatic editing. No expensive production. Just a forgotten garage, a hidden workshop, and the story of a man named Leonard Harrison whose ideas had vanished from history. Maybe a few people will watch it, Sophie said. Ethan smiled. That would be nice. The next morning, he checked the video before heading to the garage. 500 views. More than expected. By lunchtime, it had crossed 5,000. By evening, it was nearing 20,000. Comments began appearing from mechanics, engineers, car enthusiasts, and history fans from across the country. People were fascinated. Not just by the building, but by the mystery hidden beneath it. This is incredible, Sophie said, staring at her phone. People actually care. Ethan looked through the comments carefully. One message caught his attention, then another, then 10 more. Several viewers recognized Leonard Harrison's name. Some remembered stories told by parents and grandparents. Others shared old magazine articles and photographs. Piece by piece, the forgotten engineer's legacy began resurfacing. Over the following weeks, the momentum continued growing. Local newspapers called first, then regional automotive blogs. Reporters wanted interviews. Historians wanted access to the workshop. Car collectors wanted to visit. For the first time in years, vehicles began pulling into the old parking lot again. The garage that everyone had ignored was becoming a destination. Yet success brought new challenges. Ethan spent long days answering emails, managing repairs, researching Harrison's work, and maintaining the property. Sleep remained scarce. Money was still tight. The bank notices had not magically disappeared. One snowy afternoon, he sat in his office reviewing expenses when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Walker?" a professional voice asked. "This is Rebecca Morris from the Ohio Automotive Heritage Foundation." Ethan sat up straighter. "How can I help you?" "Actually, we may be able to help you. We have reviewed the material you posted. We believe the Harrison archive could have significant historical value." Ethan glanced toward the workshop door. "You are serious?" "Very serious." After the call ended, he remained silent for several moments. The possibility had never occurred to him. What he saw as a second chance for his family might also represent something larger, something valuable to thousands of people. Meanwhile, across town, Charlotte Hay sat in her office reviewing quarterly reports. Her assistant placed a tablet on the desk. "You should see this." Charlotte barely looked up. "What is it?" "The garage." Charlotte frowned. "What garage?" "The one from the auction." Her attention shifted immediately. On the screen was a news segment featuring aerial footage of the property. Cars filled the parking lot. Visitors walked through the restored sections of the building. Reporters discussed the discovery of Harrison's workshop. Charlotte watched quietly. Then she replayed the segment. And replayed it again. The same garage she had dismissed months earlier no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Her assistant studied her reaction. "Interesting story, huh?" Charlotte slowly nodded. But her expression suggested something deeper. Not regret. Not yet. Curiosity. Because, for the first time since that auction day, she found herself wondering whether Ethan Walker had seen something she had completely missed. And somewhere inside the growing crowd surrounding the garage, an opportunity far bigger than either of them imagined was beginning to take shape. By early spring, the transformation was impossible to ignore. What had once been an abandoned property at the edge of town now buzzed with life from sunrise until sunset. Visitors arrived from neighboring states. Car collectors scheduled appointments months in advance. Historians toured the hidden workshop with quiet amazement. The parking lot that had once held nothing but weeds and cracked asphalt was filled with pickup trucks, family sedans, and the occasional classic car gleaming beneath the Ohio sun. Ethan often arrived before dawn. He would unlock the front doors while the morning air still carried a trace of winter. Inside, the smell of fresh lumber, machine oil, and coffee replaced the stale scent of neglect that had once defined the building. Every week brought another improvement, another restored section, another opportunity. Yet the most surprising change was not the garage itself. It was the people. Volunteers began offering help. Retired mechanics stopped by to share knowledge. Local students asked if they could learn restoration skills. What had started as one man's second chance was becoming a community. One Saturday morning, Ethan stood near the front counter reviewing invoices when a black SUV pulled into the lot. A well-dressed man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself as David Mercer, an investor specializing in heritage automotive projects. "I have been following your story," he said. "You have built something remarkable." Ethan smiled politely. "We are still building." Mercer nodded. "Exactly why I am here." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, Ethan had been offered a partnership proposal large enough to erase every debt he carried. The numbers were bigger than anything he had imagined 6 months earlier. That evening, after Sophie finished reading through the proposal with him, she looked up from the kitchen table. "This changes everything." Ethan leaned back in his chair. Maybe, she repeated. "Dad, this is amazing." He smiled. "It is. But I want to be careful." Sophie tilted her head. "Because of the garage? Because of what it stands for." He had not spent months rebuilding a forgotten legacy only to hand it away too quickly. Money mattered. Stability mattered. But so did purpose. The following week, another opportunity arrived. Then another. Licensing discussions. Restoration contracts. Educational programs. Heritage preservation grants. Every conversation opened a new door. The small operation slowly evolved into something far larger than a local business. It was becoming a respected brand. One afternoon, While reviewing financial reports, Ethan noticed a number that made him pause. Revenue projections for the next 12 months exceeded $1 million. He stared at the page for several seconds. Not out of greed, out of disbelief. 6 months earlier, he had worried about losing his house. Now he was planning expansion. Across town, Charlotte Hayes watched another interview featuring Ethan and Sophie. This time she paid attention to every word. The confidence in Ethan's voice surprised her. The humility surprised her even more. He never spoke about proving people wrong. He never mentioned the laughter from the auction room. Instead, he talked about community, preservation, second chances, and respect for forgotten work. Charlotte found herself replaying one particular statement. Value is not always obvious at first glance, Ethan had said. Sometimes it takes patience to see what something can become. Those words lingered long after the interview ended, because Charlotte knew they were not really about buildings. And somewhere deep inside, a realization she had been avoiding for months was becoming impossible to ignore. The man she had dismissed as a dreamer was quietly building something extraordinary, and the story was only beginning. 6 months after the auction, the property no longer resembled the forgotten building Charlotte Hayes had removed from her company records. Fresh signage stood near the entrance. Restored brickwork gleamed beneath the spring sunshine. Visitors moved through guided exhibits showcasing Leonard Harrison's legacy while technicians worked inside modern restoration bays. The transformation had become one of the most talked about business stories in Ohio. On a bright Saturday morning, preparations were underway for the official opening of the expanded facility. Local officials had arrived. Reporters had arrived. Community leaders, investors, educators, and automotive enthusiasts filled the grounds. Sophie moved between volunteers carrying clipboards with the confidence of someone far older than her years. Ethan watched quietly from the edge of the crowd. Success had changed many things. It had paid off debts. It had secured their home. It had created opportunities he never imagined. Yet he still felt most comfortable standing behind the scenes. A black sedan slowly entered the parking lot. Several people glanced toward it. Charlotte stepped out wearing a navy blazer and simple pearl earrings. There was no executive entourage, no photographers, no corporate presentation, just her. For a moment she stood still, taking everything in. The renovated buildings, the growing crowd, the energy, the purpose. Months earlier she had viewed the property as a liability. Now she was looking at something entirely different. Sophie spotted her first. "Dad," she whispered. Ethan turned and saw Charlotte approaching. Their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke at first. Then Charlotte smiled. "I hope I am not too late." Ethan returned the smile. "You arrived right on time." Together they walked through the property. Charlotte listened as volunteers explained the educational programs. She watched students learning restoration techniques. She studied displays featuring Harrison's designs. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of care, patience, and vision. Eventually, they reached the hidden workshop beneath the building. Charlotte paused at the bottom of the staircase. The room was beautifully preserved. Harrison's desk remained exactly where Ethan had found it. The notebook sat protected behind glass. The original blueprint was displayed under soft lighting. Charlotte slowly shook her head. "I cannot believe this. Was here all along." Ethan nodded. "Neither could I." She looked around once more. "You saw something nobody else did." Ethan considered the statement carefully. "I think the opportunity was always here. I was just lucky enough to find it." Charlotte laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." For a few moments they stood in comfortable silence. Then Charlotte's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you know what I realized?" Ethan waited. She glanced toward the workshop around them. "I thought I sold an old building." Her voice softened. "What I actually sold was possibility." Ethan looked at her. There was no bitterness in his expression, no triumph, no desire to remind her of the laughter from months earlier. Only grace. The kind built through hardship. The kind that does not need revenge. "We all miss things sometimes," he said quietly. Charlotte lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back up. Something changed in her expression then. Respect. Genuine respect. Not for the business. Not for the headlines. For the man standing beside her. And as applause echoed from the ceremony beginning above them, Charlotte Hayes realized the most valuable thing hidden inside that forgotten property had never been the blueprint. It had been the character of the person willing to believe in it when nobody else would. 3 months later, The story that began inside a forgotten building reached a moment nobody in town could have imagined. The annual Ohio Business Leadership Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across hundreds of guests. Business owners, investors, educators, community leaders, and reporters gathered to celebrate the year's most inspiring achievements. Ethan Walker had almost declined the invitation. He preferred workshops to spotlights. He preferred projects to speeches. But Sophie had insisted. "You are going," she told him. "For once, people get to celebrate you." Now father and daughter sat together near the front of the room. Sophie wore a simple blue dress and smiled at everything. Ethan adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time. "Relax," Sophie whispered. "You look fine." Ethan laughed quietly. "Easy for you to say." Across the ballroom, Charlotte Hayes watched them from her table. Over the past months, she had become a regular visitor to the restored property. What began as curiosity had slowly evolved into friendship. Not rushed, not forced, built through conversations, shared projects, and mutual respect. She had come to admire Ethan's quiet strength, his refusal to hold grudges, his ability to see value where others saw problems. The lights dimmed. The evening's final award approached. The presenter stepped onto the stage and opened an envelope. This year's Entrepreneur of the Year award recognizes innovation, community impact, preservation of history, and extraordinary leadership. A pause followed. The recipient is Ethan Walker. The ballroom erupted into applause. Sophie jumped to her feet immediately. Charlotte joined her. Soon the entire room was standing. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. For a brief moment he simply sat there, overwhelmed by the sound. Then he slowly rose and made his way to the stage. The applause continued. Some people were celebrating a successful businessman. Others were celebrating a local hero. Many were celebrating proof that second chances still existed. Ethan accepted the award and stepped toward the microphone. The room gradually became quiet. He looked out at the crowd, then toward Sophie, then toward Charlotte. Finally he smiled. "I am grateful for this honor," he began. "But the truth is, this story was never about me." The audience listened closely. 6 months ago, most people saw an abandoned property. A few soft laughs spread through the room. Ethan nodded. "Honestly, I understood why." More laughter followed. Then his expression softened. But one decision changed everything. He looked directly toward Charlotte. "Would you come up here for a moment?" Surprise flashed across her face. The room turned to watch as she slowly approached the stage. Ethan waited until she joined him. Then he faced the audience once more. "If Charlotte had not sold me that property, none of this would exist." Silence settled over the ballroom. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that arrives when people witness genuine character. Ethan continued. "Life gives all of us opportunities. Sometimes we recognize them. Sometimes we miss them. What matters is what we choose to do next." Charlotte's eyes filled with emotion. Not because of praise. Because she understood what he had given her in that moment. Grace. No blame. No revenge. No reminder of the laughter from months before. Only dignity. The audience rose again. This time the applause felt different. Warmer. Deeper. More personal. As Ethan stood beside Sophie and Charlotte beneath the ballroom lights, he realized success was never really about buildings, money, or awards. It was about believing in possibilities others overlook. It was about character when nobody is watching. And sometimes, the most valuable thing in the world is not what you build. It is the person you become while building it.